for you to read the climate action plan. One thing you'll notice is the number of footnotes in this document. So one thing I think that our leaders need and policymakers need is people we can turn to who are vetting and looking into the highest quality data. And so it's incredible that we have, like I said, these volunteers in our community doing just that. And without further ado, I want to turn this over to Josie so she can say hi. And then we will try to cover as much as we can in the next 55 minutes. If there's something that we don't get to, put it in the chat or contact me via my website. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email after this presentation with the recording and some of the resources referenced in this talk. So there'll be lots of information for you to sink your teeth into. So Josie, welcome. And do you want to say hi?
Sure. First, thank you, Jen, for having me. And I just want to say how much I appreciate your genuine interest in the topic and your interest in just helping other District 3 or other residents of Menlo Park come up to speed too. It's just, I think it's one of the big issues of our time. So I just appreciate your curiosity.
Thanks, Josie. So as I mentioned, kind of the impetus for throwing this event together was the fires, but there's also been recent reports, and I included that in with the RSVP link to this event, of the ice sheets in Greenland melting and some sea level rise projections that are gonna hit Menlo Park directly. And I wanted to know specifically from you, what can we expect in Menlo Park with climate change, and when, I mean, we're obviously already seeing the effects with our outdoor air quality, but when are we going to really be hit by this?
Yeah, no problem. Sounds like someone might be having an issue with mute. I'm going to switch over to share my screen and show you guys some maps of Menlo Park. So I will do that right now. Just give me a minute. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is just quickly from the UN IPCC report. You might have heard about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just showing us how temperatures are rising, average temperatures on the globe are rising. And if we don't do something about greenhouse gases, that they will go beyond a threshold, which will create a lot of chaos for us. All right, so the maps. This is a map of the San Francisco Bay on the left today. And then on the right, you can see what the bay and the surrounding areas, including our community, would look like with 3 feet of sea level rise. So the light blue are areas that would become inundated with water. So one thing you can see here is that the contours of the bay would change. And it's not just a matter of, flooding during storms. This is sunny day, all the time flooding. So areas that are currently have homes and businesses and roads on them would become inundated with water. The question is, how soon is this going to happen? So when are we going to hit 3 feet of sea level rise? That is something of an unknown, although with every scientific report that's issued, that date becomes, for some years, it was considered 2100 likely that we would hit 3 feet. The latest reports say it's probably more like 2060 that we could hit 3 feet of sea level rise. So the problem is accelerating. The next slide, Menlo Park residents will recognize the old Sun Microsystems campus, which is now Facebook, which is up, let's see, kind of up here. That and Bayfront Express in front, which runs onto the Dunbarton Bridge. You can see today, and then you can see with that 3 feet of sea level rise, what that looks like. So again, the Facebook campus, the old Sun campus, is surrounded by water, and we would be unable to access the Dunbarton Bridge parts of Willow Road would be underwater, and about half of Bellhaven, so half of the real estate east of 101 would be underwater.
Wow. So this is with just 3 feet of sea level rise.
That's right. Yeah.
I read recently that 3 feet might be an optimistic projection. Can you?
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, it's all a matter of time. So 3 feet, we were thinking it was 2100. Now we're thinking maybe it's more like 2050 or 2060. And then by 2100, we may be bumping up against 6 feet or 10 feet of sea level rise. These are all possibilities. And there's just so much unknown. You know, quick, not so fun fact, but the last time the Earth had this similar level of concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is above 400 parts per million. The last time this happened on Earth was 3 million years ago. And when we look back at the fossil record and doing, you know, core samples in Antarctica, it's clear that the sea level was actually about 50 to 60 feet higher than it is today. So I'm not telling you that we know that we're going to have 50 or 60 feet of sea level rise, but that's our latest data point in Earth's history. Was the last time we had this level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the sea level was that much higher. So if we let the problem go unaddressed for some time, you know, that could happen.
Wow. And when we're talking about the year 2050 or 2060, I mean, my kids who are 10 and 12 now, I mean, they're going to be in their 40s. I mean, I'm in my 40s. So this is not a distant thing. So this is a huge problem. And to be honest, like, I'm quite anxious about this, and it seems quite daunting, especially if we're talking about the 3 feet being, you know, optimistic. So what, now you're going to show some fire stuff, maybe not. So how do we even begin to think about how to address this, Josie?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. And I think the general public, there's a lot of polling that shows that people now, because climate change is starting to affect us all in our everyday lives, whether it's the fires or hurricanes or flooding. So there's a lot of polling showing that people now actually feel quite a bit of concern about the issue. The big gap now, and this is what we're trying to tackle in Menlo Park, the big gap now is people's anxiety level of understanding that there's a problem, but then their understanding of what is going to be required to address the problem. So I think people right now, and tell me what you think, Jen, but I think people right now kind of put this into the category of like recycling, you know, like maybe I'm going to have to recycle more, or, you know, in the 80s, we all got told, you know, sort your trash, start recycling. So we're going to require an effort that's much greater than that. So I think we all need to shift our thinking in a really major way. So
yeah, because I mean, I think that, yay, we're recycling. So you're saying that's not going to get us where we need to go.
It's not going to cut it, no. So we need to be looking at this, comparing the level of threat that this climate change is posing to us, both to our economy, to our lives, to our property, to our, even the very functioning of our society. We need to be comparing this to the threat that Nazi Germany posed to the US in World War II. So in terms of the scale of the threat and the problem, they're similar. In fact, I would even say climate change perhaps poses a greater threat. So once you understand that, then you ask yourself, okay, so what are we willing to do? What are we willing to sacrifice to solve this problem? And one reference point, and I was just doing some research on this, was what did our grandparents do? What were they willing to, how did they pull together? And what were they willing to sacrifice in order to defeat Nazi Germany? So some of the things, you know, we all know was they instituted a draft. So they were willing to send their sons off to die, potentially. They were willing to convert a third of the economy from civilian purposes over to military purposes. So it was hard to buy a car because those car factories were pumping out tanks. We instituted rations. So people, you know, there were rations on everything from butter to coffee, sugar, tires, clothing, gasoline. Another thing our grandparents were willing to do was buy war bonds. Americans bought $185 billion worth of war bonds, and that actually funded about half of the military spending to win the war. And then we planted, or our grandparents, not we, but Americans planted victory gardens, which actually contributed significantly to the food production. So that's what our grandparents did. That's what the greatest generation did. So the question is, what are we willing to do? And I think it's going to have to be much, much more than recycling, right? But the good news is it doesn't have to be as bad as what I just laid out. We do not have to send our sons off to war. What do we have to do? We have to be willing to, it's really simple, make some different choices about how we drive and how we heat our homes and our water at home. And the good news is we don't have to give up any creature comforts. The technology is there. We may have to pay a little bit more to make this transition. But if you compare it to the sacrifices that our grandparents made, I hope that people understand that, and looking at the threat that this poses, I hope people understand that it's well worth it.
So, do you think that, one of the reasons that we are holding this event is to raise the awareness of the threat, because, and to give people hope and agency and that we can do something about it. But, Nazi Germany and seeing, some of those images on screen feels very tangible. Well, I'm a Jewish American, so for me, that's particularly threatening. Do you feel like climate change has reached that level among people here, or people are still kind of with their heads down and not really feeling that?
It's tough. At the moment we're facing a pandemic and so many other issues. There's a lot to be worried about. But I do feel hopeful that, again, because people do see this impacting their everyday lives in some ways, in a way before, we really did in America for the Second World War. People are seeing fires, they're breathing smoke. I think, one thing that I stop to think about sometimes is during my lifetime, this is probably the best it's going to be. Meaning, in terms of fires, I know we all think it's terrible right now, but it's actually, before I die, I don't actually think it's going to get better.
Yeah, I heard some statistic that said, like, instead of thinking this as the hottest year on record, thinking in the next 50 years, this is going to be actually the coolest year on record.
Yeah. So that's motivation, right? And it's something that's hitting home. So I think that's where we go to find the motivation to start doing the right things.
Okay, so you said, it sounds like we're talking about some sacrifices, not at the level of sending people off to war or, rationing things, but we do have to make some different decisions. Specifically, you said around cars and driving and on what we have in our home. Can you talk a little bit more? Those sound like purchasing decisions. So what exactly does that look like?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that are huge in terms of carbon reduction when you look at it globally. And then I'm going to hone in on 2 of those 3. So the 3 things are, 1 is stop buying or using gasoline. And most people use that to get around in a vehicle. So get rid of your gas vehicle and switch to either an e-bike or an electric vehicle, or just ditch the car altogether and do what Jen does a lot of, which is biking and walking. The next thing is you want to stop burning any form of natural gas in your home. So that's getting rid of any appliance that uses natural gas. The big consumers of natural gas in your home are your furnace and your water heater. Other things could be your stove, your dryer. Those are, pool heater, that type of thing. The third thing you can do, and I'm not going to focus on this, but the third thing you can do that has a really big impact is cut back on the amount of meat and dairy products that you consume. So I don't see government probably getting into that in a big way, whereas I think there are things that government can do to encourage the correct purchasing decisions. In terms of those appliances in the car that I talked about, but in terms of your food choices, I would encourage you to consider that and to do your research and to look at the options. But for this conversation, I think we'll focus on vehicles and on the gas appliances in the home.
And full disclosure that I did just have a cheeseburger from Jeffrey's last night, but now I feel bad about it. So thanks, Josie. I feel bad about it for many reasons, but yeah, something to think about. Yep. So it sounds like what you're talking about in order to make the changes in time to make a dent in climate change is that, you know, we need to change the way we get around, and we need to kind of get new stuff into our house. I know that where we're going, where you're going to start talking about is kind of government mandates and regulations. You know, why can't we just all become really educated on this and all just decide or pledge that we're going to do this? Why does government need to step in kind of with a heavy hand on these topics?
Yeah. So first of all, I should have done it at the top, but I want to give a disclaimer. I'm Josie, speaking as Josie, Jen's friend, and a District 3 resident. I do serve on the city's Environmental Quality Commission, but I am not speaking for the commission. We're so lucky to have Tom Cabot on the call with us, and he and I, together with James Payne, wrote the city's climate action plan, and a lot of what I'm discussing is in the plan, and that was approved by City Council. But what I'm talking about now is just my own personal views. I just want to make sure it's not the city's position necessarily, and it's not the Environmental Quality's position, commission's position. Yeah. So the question was, can we do this without some sort of government intervention? So I'm a business person. I went to business school because I believe that most of the problems we have in society actually can be solved by really creative entrepreneurial business people coming up with solutions to those problems. And that's why I went to work in the solar industry. And that was a time when there was no mandate for solar. There is now, but there wasn't then. Because I believe that that's the way to solve these big, hairy problems. So I've been looking at climate now for 10, 15 years. And no matter how I look at it, at this point, we're so behind in terms of the time to address this problem. We don't have time actually to just leave it to free markets. We don't even have time to just leave it to sort of voluntary choices supported by rebates or by incentives. And so why do I think that? Well, Palo Alto is a good example. They decided 3 years ago that they were going to start promoting heat pump water heaters to their citizens, and they were going to offer a generous rebate for it. They have had very low uptake on that. So very few people taking advantage of the rebates. People ask me why. I don't really know why, but you know, we do live in one of the wealthiest counties in the US, and it may be that people just aren't that motivated to use those rebates, that's not a motivating factor for them. What we have seen work is a mandate, so a requirement, for example, when your water heater burns out, or when or is nearing the end of its life, or your gas furnace is nearing the end of its useful life, that you not be able to replace it with a similar gas device, that you must replace it with a high efficiency heat pump device. And the reasoning is that if you install a furnace today, gas furnace today, it is likely to still be working in the year 2050, because the average life of a furnace is between 25 and 30 years. The state of California, I believe, will no longer be distributing natural gas to homes in 2050. It doesn't align with the state's climate goals, which is to be carbon neutral by that point. And natural gas is a huge greenhouse gas emitter. So if you, as a Menlo Park resident, install a gas furnace today, at some point between now and the end of its useful life, you're going to have to rip it out. So actually, the city is sort of looking ahead over the horizon, seeing this issue coming, and I believe actually helping citizens by, and this hasn't been instituted yet, but the city is looking at it, instituting an ordinance that would say you have to convert from your, when your furnace is getting ready to die, you have to convert over to electric.
So Josie, you talked about kind of we were talking about kind of 4 appliances in the house that currently run on natural gas that most of us have. I think it was the furnace, the water heater, the dryer, and our stovetop.
Yeah.
So you're talking about we shouldn't really be replacing any of those with gas again. Those all should go electric.
Yeah.
So I remember when the Toyota Prius first came out, and I think it was my family, or I remember some family having a discussion about whether or not to get one because it sounded really cool, and worrying about mechanics. And wow, if you get this new technology, will anyone even know how to service it? So like, I'm even confused. I think people here may have never heard of a heat pump. Like if we wanted to, let's say, be like, this was such an inspiring talk, we're all going to have to convert at some point anyway. I want to be on the forefront. I want to go out and get a heat pump. I don't even know, like, what even is that? Where would we get one? Who would install it? Like, are we there yet? Are we, as a society, ready to turn over? Because if we put these mandates in place before the infrastructure is laid down to do this, then we're setting ourselves up to fail. So what do we need to do as a society to kind of prime the pump, no pun intended, to get this electrification going?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so all of the technology exists. Much of it is very mature. So you could buy a heat pump water heater at Home Depot. And they're American companies that make them. They're actually quite prevalent in the US Southeast because they don't have a very developed natural gas distribution infrastructure. So because you can't get natural gas hookups at your house, it's either propane or electric. And so heat pumps are very widely used. They've improved over the last 30 years so that they actually can work in very cold environments, which in their early years, they were not as good at that, but that's totally irrelevant to us because of our climate. So heat pumps address California's climate perfectly. To your question about installers, yes, our installers around here, because California has been so dependent on natural gas for our heating and water heating, most of the installers, our installer base is very connected to natural gas. They know it well, they like it, and like anyone who's just developed an expertise, they don't want to change. So it is a little bit harder to find an installer right now, but more and more are coming online. And we saw Sacramento go through something similar a year or two ago where they started offering a rebate program, and they have many, many installers now just within a couple of years of having a rebate program who will do this and will do it for an affordable price.
So what's it going to take then to put in these mandates and rebates? Because I would assume that the best approach would be both incentives and, and other things. So what are we waiting for?
Yeah, so the city is studying this. It was proposed in the climate action plan, and city staff right now are putting a team together to look at actually crafting an ordinance that would require this. And they're doing all their due diligence around the economics of it and the legality of it, et cetera. So that's all happening now on that side. In terms of the subsidy, the rebates, Peninsula Clean Energy is completely on board. So as many of you know, we converted in terms of our electricity generation, we converted from PG&E over to Peninsula Clean Energy, who now sources all of our electricity. PG&E still delivers it on the wires and sends us a bill, but Peninsula Clean Energy now sources it, and they source clean energy for us. So I believe it's 95% this year is carbon free, which is great.
And PG&E is like old school.
PG&E is somewhat old school. I mean, the state has set some really high thresholds for converting over by 2045 to 100% carbon free. So PG&E is following sort of the state schedule for that, but Peninsula Clean Energy, our local for San Mateo County, Peninsula Clean Energy just did that much more rapidly. So right now, if you want to buy an electric car, you can feel confident that the electricity that you're using to fuel your car is clean. So Peninsula Clean Energy is completely on board, and they just approved $6 million for San Mateo County residents to, and they're creating the rebate program right now, but $6 million will go into this rebate program that will help Menlo Park, but all San Mateo County residents to make these purchases of heat pump water heaters, and potentially, this hasn't been nailed down yet, but potentially heat pump space heaters as well. So
So,
I want to just throw out one little, I just remembered this, one selling point on a heat pump space heater. So these are sold by companies like Carrier and Train. The people that install air conditioners, they also install heat pumps for you. So you could call one of those up today and get it installed. The advantage of a heat pump over your gas furnace is it automatically gives you air conditioning. So in the summer, it's going to give you air conditioning. In the winter, it's just a little valve, it gets reversed and it pumps heat into your house. So it's one unit that does both things. So in that way, you might pay more for that than you would have for a replacement gas furnace, but you get a huge benefit of air conditioning.
and isn't all the gas super leaky too? Like both in your home and in society, because the pipes are older. So
yeah, so that's an issue. If you all remember the San Bruno pipeline explosion, which killed people, the gas distribution and transmission lines in California are aging. And so it's a big issue actually for PG&E is, do they invest billions of dollars? And those will be dollars that we pay as ratepayers in upgrading all those gas lines, or do they just abandon the gas lines and decide, we're going to go switch over to electric? So I can't tell you where they stand yet on gas for existing buildings, but on gas for new buildings, they have come out in favor of our position, which is no new natural gas lines. So think about it. PG&E, the people who deliver the gas, have said, we don't want to build any more natural gas pipelines. And they have done that publicly with the California Energy Commission. So they are completely on the right side of the climate issue for new buildings.
Gas won't even go into a new building.
Well, that's what they don't want to do it. They're legally bound to do it, but they're asking the state to be unbound so that they do no longer have to provide that.
Wow. So, so with the climate action plan, once again, so the City Council of Menlo Park took a bold step, I think in June, and adopted this incredible plan that you and Tom and James and your subcommittee and your commission developed in order to get us carbon neutral by 2030, so we can stave off some of these impacts of climate change. So the council agreed and adopted this plan. So does that mean, what does that mean? Are we doing these things? So like what action has actually been taken, and have they adopted all of your recommendations? And, is everyone at the city working on this, or what does it look like to us?
Yeah. So if for anyone who looked at the plan, we recommended 6 actions. And this is in the context of COVID, where the city budget was really cut back. So originally we were going to propose 76 actions over a 3-year period. So wow. We had to really shrink it because we have a reduced staff. So we proposed 6, staff came back and said we can only do 3. So they are working on a phase out of natural gas in existing buildings. It's action number 1. Number 3, which is increasing the EV charging infrastructure throughout the city, especially for multifamily residents where there's sort of a split incentive there, where the landlord doesn't have any reason to install EV charging for their residents. And yet that means all those folks who live in multifamily would be really hard pressed to switch over to an EV. So that's number 3, and they're moving forward on that one. And then number 5, which is trying to electrify all of the city's operations. So all of the fleet vehicles, whether it's for tree trimming or the police cars, converting those over to electric, and then also all of the buildings, just like we're talking about the heat pumps, converting all the gas uses over to electric uses. So those are the things the city decided to move forward on this year in this really budget constrained environment. There are 3 actions that they decided not to move forward on. One of those is creating an adaptation plan for the city, especially for District 1, which is when I showed you those maps. For example, are we going to build seawalls or levees? The county has looked at that. It's cost about $100 million for us and for East Palo Alto, just for our little section of shoreline.
And that was just for a 3-foot wall, not even a 6 or a 10-foot wall, right?
Or a wall to address 3 feet of sea level rise,
Okay,
yes.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a 2017 study that was done that came up with a $100 million price tag. And, you know, the science has evolved since then, right? We probably shouldn't build for 3 feet. We should probably, if we're going to build seawalls or levees, we should probably build for 6 or 10 feet. So we got to go back and look at the cost. So it's probably not 100 million. It's probably more like $500 million, something like that. But so that needs to be coordinated with the county. So, but what is the plan for District 1, right? Like what, you know, are we going to build that seawall or levee? Even if we do, then you have a wall of water sitting next to a whole bunch of people. There's 2,500 people whose homes would be at risk. So, and we don't want to have like a Katrina situation where the levee breaks and, you know, so there's just a lot of thorny issues to work through. So for now, that's been delayed while the county figures out what's the county going to propose. Because all the cities
even though this could be happening in 30 years.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's been delayed, but it's been delayed by a year or two. And in the meantime, I'll say on all these 3 actions that the city decided to delay for now, that the commissioners on the Environmental Quality Commission all want to continue in our free time to work on these issues. And if anyone here wants to help us work on them, that would be great. So we're proposing to City Council to be allowed to continue working on the issues, even though we don't have the staff. Because of the budget crisis, we don't have the staff to work on them. The other 2 issues that are deferred for now is one is setting a citywide goal for EV adoption and reduction of gasoline sales in the city, and then kind of marketing that and reporting it back to citizens so we can see what kind of progress we're making. And then number 4, which is trying to reduce our vehicle miles traveled, which is this sort of wonky term, sometimes condensed to the acronym VMT. So reducing our vehicle miles traveled in the city by doing 2 things. One is creating an interconnected pathway or interconnected network of pedestrian and bike pathways that are protected and people feel comfortable using. Tree line, comfortable, all those things, like really building that out so people get out of their cars and can make those trips to the grocery store using a bike or an e-bike or walking, whatever it might be. And the other way to reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled, is to rezone to encourage density near transit. So for example, instead of trying to build a bunch of housing out along the bay where we don't have great public infrastructure and we're going to be kind of creating churn with cars, is to try to build it near Caltrain or other transit hubs.
Well, so first of all, with the vehicle miles traveled goal, that's a topic really near and dear to my heart. So as many of you know, I started out as a Safe Routes to School advocate, which I still am. But it just goes to show how all of these issues are interconnected, because if we can build out these transportation networks and improve our transit, and if we can also work on our land use policies, where we put our housing, that will address our climate issues, really. And so with these 6 actions that your commission have recommended to the council, they're working on 3 of them. It sounds like 3 of them, they don't have the capacity to kind of handle right now. Now, when you think about how much of an impact each of those items could make, how are we doing? So if we put in EV, what would be the benefit of putting in EV chargers versus the benefit of addressing, you know, the bike and ped? Like, do they have equivalent benefits in the end? Or like, how are they prioritizing which action to work on?
I think the prioritization maybe was done more on what resources do we have. Like the transportation department right now is stretched thin. So that was, I think, one of the reasons that the VMT reduction was deferred for now. There are also some other parallel activities that could help that, which is the implementation of the transportation master plan, which includes some of the creating bike paths, et cetera. So there, I think that, I don't know exactly how the city council ended up prioritizing, but I can tell you kind of the big hitters in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction are action number 1, which is phasing out fossil fuels from existing buildings. That's a really big one. That's the bulk of it, actually.
That's the electrifying.
Electrifying buildings.
That's all those appliances that you were talking about.
Yep, yep. And the other big one is the VMT reduction. If we can reduce our VMT in the city by 25%, meaning all of us, all the driving we do, reduce that by 25%, that has a huge impact on our greenhouse gas emissions too.
Okay, so one question that's near and dear to my heart, and I know a bunch of people asked about this, is how do you apply an equity lens to this work? Because when we start thinking about new appliances that we're buying or renters, you know, I worry about a landlord saying, well, if I have to put in all these EV chargers, or if I have to convert all these stoves to this, I'm going to pass along that cost to my renters, and then there's displacement, all these, you know, unintended consequences. So how have you thought about how this is going to hit lower income folks, you know, seniors on a pension, and how you're thinking about, you know, District 1 in particular, who is going to feel the fastest effects of climate change, but who also probably has the fewest resources among its residents to adopt these new things.
Yeah, it's really important. And you're right to point out that there are, you want to look at the impact, which is disproportionately affects brown and Black people throughout the globe, actually, as well as in Menlo Park, affecting our District 1 residents more so than the rest of us. So in terms of the problem, it disproportionately affects people of color. So that means it's really important for all of us to address the problem, even if we're not people of color. So, so the equity impacts are there on the sort of the impact side. Now, on the solution side, you're right. So one of the things we wrote into the climate action plan is that any sort of mandate needs to be, the low income residents need to be made whole. So they cannot, you know, low income residents have to be, have the choices that all of us presumably are going to have to make, that they will not have to bear a cost related to that transition. So for example, Peninsula Clean Energy, as I mentioned, the $6 million rebate program, they actually set aside $2 million of that $6 just for low income residents to be able to fully electrify their homes. So they're keeping an eye on that. We will be too. You know, just like with the war effort that I referred to earlier in the conversation, you know, some people paid higher taxes. The highest earners in America paid, you know, and I'm not saying that this is what will happen for this issue, but to fund the war, the highest income earners paid 90% marginal tax rate. So, you know, and the lowest earners did not have to contribute as much. So, you know, we have to address these issues in a fair way. And I'm fully confident that, you know, we will be able to do that. And in so doing, stimulate the kind of post-war growth, the multi-decade post-war growth that we saw in you know, all of that conversion that happened with the economy and the technology that came out of it. There's something similar. If we do this right, there's a similar economic boost that can be gained from making this transition.
Yeah, I think I sent everyone in their RSVP that Vox article about electrifying everything. And a big focus of that article was about job creation, that this could help. So if we're talking about kind of moving a lot to electrification, you know, I think it was last week we were dealing with some rolling blackouts. So I think people get really nervous when, if we're going to be relying more on electricity, yet here we are, you know, undergoing blackouts. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think about it a lot. So first of all, the blackouts, we're experiencing two forms of blackouts. One was the rolling blackouts because there was a fear, although I think it's going to be shown to be unfounded, that we didn't have enough electricity in the moment to meet our demands. The other type of blackout, of course, that we're all familiar with, has happened in the last few years, is these public safety power shutoffs. They're different. Those are to turn off the line so they don't ignite these really dry forests that have come about from drought. So in both cases, there's a, you know, the impetus for the problem is climate change. In the first one, you know, it was really hot. We had record heat, and it wasn't just in our region, it was throughout the Western region. We often import power from other places, but they were all using a lot of power to stay cool. And then we needed more power than we had forecasted to stay cool. And so there's a climate impact that's actually causing the problem. And then in terms of the impact, and I think people sometimes get afraid, you know, they're told, well, if I give up my gas furnace, they think it's like their gas furnace is like a safety blanket or something. The reality is, if you have a gas furnace like I do, sitting in your garage, and a ductwork throughout your house, people have different kinds of gas heaters, but if you have that type, it uses an electric blower, which means if you have a power shut off, it will not work. So it's not really the safety blanket that you might think it is. Now, your gas hot water heater might work. Newer ones wouldn't because they have electric ignition. Your old gas water heater might work in a like a public safety power shut off. Your gas stove probably would work if it would work if you used a match to light it instead of a electric igniter. So what can you do if you have electrified your house? You know, you no longer have the gas stove, you no longer have the gas water heater. You know, again, remember we talked about sacrifices, and I said it's not going to be free and it's not going to be completely easy. But if you had made that conversion and you found yourself in the midst of a power shut off, you could do one thing. So for cooking, you should have a camp stove. We live in earthquake country, and if we have an earthquake, you're not going to have your natural gas for your gas stove. So you should have a camp stove. That should be part of your emergency kit. And in a case of a power shut off, if you have an electric stove, pull out your gas stove. Or your camp stove. That's what you should do. In the case of the water heater, you know, I mean, yeah, you might have to give up hot showers until the electric comes back on. One thing you could do to kind of coast through that tough period would be to get a really large tank on your water heater. So if you have a 60-gallon tank on your water heater, maybe when you electrify, you bump it up to 80 gallons. And then you'll have 80 gallons of hot water to get you through, let's say, a 3-day period.
And weren't we talking at one point about some battery storage, almost like these little mini generator things that people might be working on? Yeah,
that's a really good point. So like solar, you know, was really expensive and now it's cheap. Battery storage in your garage was expensive and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. So that's if you are medically vulnerable. Actually, if you're medically vulnerable, I think you can get a free portable battery from PCE right now.
Peninsula Clean Energy
are giving out free batteries for people who are medically vulnerable to get through the power shutoffs. If you don't like the idea of not having power for, it could be 3 days, you know, or longer, one thing you can do is invest in a storage system in your garage. And that would enable you to, especially if you paired it with solar, you could pretty much go indefinitely, keeping your refrigerator running, keeping your, you know, still being able to use an electric stove. Like that would really set you up well for getting through those power shutoffs. It's not available to everyone because it is, you know, it's on the pricier side, but there are rebates. So
if I wanted to electrify tomorrow, but I wanted to have that backup, like where would I even find that?
Find the installation or the rebates?
No, like the backup battery stuff.
Yeah. So there are a bunch of companies, and I'm probably not supposed to like promote any particular one.
But you could like Google it and figure it out. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sunrun, Tesla, SunPower, like basically anyone who installs solar also installs battery systems. And like 50% of people who install solar now, at least with one of the companies, I just was listening to their earnings call, people ask for storage these days, and it's because of this power shutoff problem.
So there were several questions, and I've thought about this too, about, you know, other things that could impact climate change, other actions that the city could take, ranging from planting a larger tree canopy for carbon capture, banning leaf blowers because of those gas emissions. There were some questions, you know, different ideas. Why weren't those in the climate action plan, and what are your thoughts about addressing some of those issues?
Yeah. These are all really, none of these things is a bad thing to do. Getting rid of gas leaf blowers, really good to do, especially for your health. Planting more trees, really good to do. What we had to do was come up with the highest impact few things we could do with a very limited amount of staff time. So
the biggest bang for the buck.
Biggest bang for the buck. So I was using the 80-20 rule. So I think with the plan, we're addressing like 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we looked at, like, for example, a leaf blower used for 30 minutes a week produces about 100 pounds of CO2 emissions per year versus a gasoline car, which produces 13,000 pounds of CO2 emissions per year, or a gas furnace, which produces 7,000 pounds of CO2 per year. So right, there's like 100 times difference between those things. So, while the leaf blowers are really important, they put out a lot of really bad stuff for your lungs, but from a carbon perspective, they're just like 1/100th of the making the switch away from the gas car. So that's why we're focused there. But that doesn't mean that those other issues aren't, really vital and important, and that we won't get to them once we get these others right. But we need to get on the right path for these big equipment purchases that last decades.
So I think that really highlights an important point when we're looking at what action the city can take and locally, because a lot of, having attended kind of 4 years of city council meetings, a lot of the things that come before the city council would be amazing to do. And a lot of times it comes down to prioritization and having to make really tough choices given the limited resources that are available. So that being said, like right now, we're looking at an economic recession. We have COVID, our small businesses are, really suffering, a mass eviction crisis may take place. How can we contextualize, how can we put this in perspective of all the other priorities that the city has to deal with? And how do you justify saying, no, this is the thing that should take precedence over everything else?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think sometimes we can get very focused on the here and now, right? The problem of tomorrow, and forget about the problem of, next year. And I guess what I would say is just the scale of this problem and the impact that it's going to have on our, our children and our grandchildren is so great. And we did some analysis on the commission showing that if we spend $1 today, we can potentially forego $100 of impact later. So that's a tough thing to ignore, right? I mean, are we willing to pass this on to our children and our grandchildren and leave them with this horrible, it has the potential to bankrupt whole countries. So I think that the scale of the problem needs to be remembered. And in terms of the council and leadership, it's tough. I mean, council members have a lot of things they have to choose between. I think one of the really important roles that leaders play in a crisis, and we are in a crisis, 2 crises, but we are in a climate crisis. One of the important roles that a leader can play is they march up the hill, they look over the hill, and they look at the horizon over to the horizon, and they see how big is this problem? What is the problem? They are the ones who are surveying the horizon to figure out what the deal is. Then the job of a leader is to turn around and to give us the unvarnished truth, right? Don't sugarcoat it for us. Tell us what the problem is. And, we're looking at a really big problem here. The next step is don't leave us in despair, right? Give us a plan, give us solutions, tell us what we need to do. And we need to trust you and the other city leaders that the plan is good, right? And maybe we need to look at the plan, those of us following you. But the leaders have a really important to play, especially when you have this gap in understanding, I think, among most people about what they think needs to be done, what they think they personally need to do, and what they really need to do. Leaders play a really important role who can say, here's the science, here's the math, here's the situation, this is where we're going, jump on board, and we're gonna win.
Well, and I think that's something that COVID has really shown a lot of, that if we listen to science and listen to experts and elevate real data, then, we should follow that. So to have people like you and Tom and James and your commission footnoting all this for us, right, raising these issues. So one thing that I wonder though, and that I've heard brought up, let's say Menlo Park does this. We put on our World War II, we can do it mentality. We all go electric. We stop driving our cars so much. We have these beautiful networked bike lanes. Yet everybody else in the world doesn't do anything. And so why did we bother? What was the point of the sacrifice? We're this tiny town and this is a global problem. So what is Menlo? Why are we the ones that have to do all this sacrifice? What's the point?
Yeah, great question. And we get this a lot. So here's what not everyone may know here. Little Menlo Park in September decided in new construction that we were no longer going to allow natural gas hookups or natural gas appliances to be used in new buildings. There were a couple exceptions, but Berkeley had done it before us, but we decided to take a totally different approach, legally in the way we did it. The way we did it, we thought we would be the only ones. It turns out 30 other cities around the state have copied what we've done. So I get on calls.
September.
Yeah.
It was like a domino. It was like every week. Yeah.
So I get on calls with people all over the state and they will say, oh, in my city, we're taking to council a Menlo Park style reach code, it's called. So we're famous. But really, the point of that is not that we're famous. The point of that is what Little Menlo Park did is now spreading throughout the state. And now the state's actually considering it, making it the law of land for the entire state of California. So that says to me that, and I was a little skeptical, I was kind of in that same camp of what really impact can we make? But what we did now is is changing the conversation at the state level. And then here's another fun fact that people who don't follow these issues closely may not know is what the state of California does on the environment often gets copied by 10 other progressive states, including the state of New York, Massachusetts, and those states comprise between a third and a half of the US population, depending on, who's included in that coalition. But other states did that on our setting our CAFE standards, so high efficiency standards for our vehicle fleets, and also on setting our renewable energy standards for our portfolio of for the electric grid. So there's a precedent for this, and although it's not guaranteed that what we do will have this larger impact, it's our best hope at this point. And we're doing everything we can to make it happen.
So we only have 2 more minutes left. So speaking of hope, and I apologize to those of you who I have not actually been reading the chat because I've been trying to listen very closely to Josie, but we will definitely review those questions and get back to any outstanding questions that are there. But what can we do? What can people on this call do who spent, an hour of their weekend with us? If we hear you, we believe you, we want to make a future for our kids and grandkids, what can we do?
Yeah, good question. And I will get to that in just a second. I want to point out one other thing, which was I should have mentioned when you were asking, why do this? Even if we aren't able to spark this US, potentially global big transition, we will, if we do this right, we will make our own air so much cleaner. Do you remember when the COVID shutdown happened and we all walked outside and the sky was blue and the air was clean and
before the fires.
This was before the fire. Thank you for that. And the birds you could hear birds, no traffic noise, all those things could be permanent for us. So rates of heart disease would go down, rates of lung cancer would go down, rates of asthma would go way down. All of these things would be really improved. So even if we don't get all those add-on benefits, those will be concrete changes to our lives that will really pay off. So what can you do? First is vote. Anyone who's a climate denier, we don't want them in making these decisions. We want that leader on the hill who's ready to, lead the charge. So in our case, that's Jen. She really cares about this issue, as you can tell. Another thing you could do is sign up for their organizations. There's a wonderful organization called Menlo Spark here in Menlo Park, which has been working on this issue for, I think, 10 years. And Mitch Slomiak, who's on the call, is a founder, and he's been involved in these issues forever. He created the Environmental Quality Commission, actually, on which I serve. Thank you,
And I
Mitch.
love the name Menlo Spark because it embraces that concept of Menlo Park sparking this action, you know, all over that we talked about.
Exactly. So sign up to get on their newsletter and you'll get informed about all the latest and greatest happening. The other thing you could do is, if you're curious about your own carbon footprint, sign up for the Menlo Green Challenge, and that's menlogreenchallenge.org. It's a great organization. There's already 600 households in Menlo Park who are on it. So people who like plugged in their data to figure out what's their carbon footprint, and then it suggests ways for you to lower your carbon footprint and gives you links to, you know, EV websites that show you all the different great EV choices out there, for example. You know, another thing you could do is write to the city council and express support for these ideas. Votes come up. If you want to be, Menlo Spark is a good way to know when those votes are coming up, but if you're interested in these issues and you really want to work on them like Tom and I do in our free time, contact Jen, contact me. Jen can connect you to me, but we're looking for other people who are passionate and knowledgeable, or willing to really study and get knowledgeable, so that you can get out there and be advocates too.
Yeah, I'm thinking, like, if I were to get elected, you know, obviously these are things that I think are important to have happen, but there has to be, you know, support for these things to happen. So yeah. This conversation hopefully is the first of many taking place in living rooms and book clubs. And, you know, if you have a group of friends, it doesn't have to be about my campaign at all. If you want to invite Josie to come talk to people you know about these issues, this is what we need to do. We need to raise the awareness and the understanding of what needs to happen, so that, you know, we have people, you know, asking and demanding action, because our children and our grandchildren, you know, are going to have a different kind of life.
Yeah, I connect all this work to my son. So when I die, hopefully it's many decades from now, but when I die, I want him to know, because I think the problem is going to be much, much worse when I die. I want him to know that I did everything that I possibly could to make this world a better place. So if you're interested in joining that, joining forces and work on the problem, reach out. We'd love to get you involved.
Well, Josie, we cannot thank you enough, not only for being at this event tonight, but really for the work that you're doing every day, because you care so deeply. And Tom, to you too, and all the others working on this issue. This is a all hands on deck project. And the point of this wasn't to feel doomy and gloomy. The point was to kind of wake up and realize that we can do this. We just have to decide to do it. So thank you again, Josie. And I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to close us out.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Josie. This has been super informative. Wow, I feel a lot smarter after this. I hope everyone feels the same, and thank you so much for all of your input in the chat. There's been so much good conversation going on the side.
I haven't seen any of it. I'm dying to see it.
We've recorded it, so
okay,
we'll
great.
check it out later and we'll respond to any questions, but it's been really great. So clearly there are a lot of people on this Zoom who also have a lot of knowledge about the subject, so we appreciate you taking part. So thank you, everyone. We don't want to take up any more of your time. We will send out a follow-up with some resources that were mentioned here and were dropped in the chat intermittently. And also, just to plug the campaign, if anyone is interested in joining, you can check out Jen at jenwolosin.com and get in touch with myself or anyone else on the team. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.